Dirt crunched under Garfield's boots as the auctioneer's gavel fell. 3 gold coins. That was the price for a woman shivering under a burlap sack, tossed aside like spoiled grain. He didn't want a wife. He just hated the noise. But then, she finally pulled the sack off. Dust choked the main thoroughfare of Oakhaven, a mining town that had outlived its silver and was now just slowly grinding its inhabitants down to bone. Garfield Cobb spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dirt, adjusting the heavy burlap sack of flour on his right shoulder. The sun was a hammer against the back of his neck. It smelled like sulfur, stale beer, and horse manure. He hated coming down from the ridge. He was halfway to his pack mule when the shouting started. It wasn't the usual drunken brawl outside the saloon. This was a rhythmic, barking cadence, a hawker's pitch. Garfield paused, his calloused thumb hooked under the leather strap of his suspenders. A crowd of miners, ranch hands, and drifters had formed a loose ring near the livery stable. Garfield didn't care for crowds, but his mule was hitched past the mob. He pushed his way through the periphery, ignoring the sour reek of unwashed bodies. In the center of the ring stood Jedediah Rust, a man whose teeth were rotting out of his skull and who always smelled faintly of rancid tallow. Jedediah held a length of frayed hemp rope. The other end of the rope was tied around the wrists of a woman. She was small, though it was hard to tell her true shape beneath the oversized, mud-stained calico dress that hung off her frame like rags on a scarecrow. But that wasn't what had the crowd murmuring. Her head was entirely swallowed by a coarse grain sack. The bottom edge was frayed, brushing against her collarbone. A single, jagged slit had been cut near the mouth to let her breathe. But otherwise, she was completely blinded. She stood rigid. Her shoulders didn't shake. She wasn't crying. "I'm telling you, the bitch is cursed," Jedediah bellowed, kicking at the dirt. He yanked the rope, forcing the woman to stumble forward a half step. She caught her balance, her bare feet digging into the sharp pebbles. Bought her off a wagon train from Missouri to be a proper wife. Paid $2 and a good hunting knife for her. But she's ruined. Look at her, hide her face. She's a monster, I tell you. A pure fright. The devil's own handiwork. A few men laughed. One of them, a drunk with a patchy beard, spat. "If she's that ugly, Jed, why don't you just shoot her and spare us the view?" "Bullets cost money," Jedediah snarled. "I'm recouping my losses. Give me $2. $1. Someone take this wretched thing off my hands before I leave her for the coyotes." Garfield stood still. The heavy flour sack dug into his collarbone. He watched the woman's chest rise and fall. The breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, ragged sound that cut through the low murmurs of the crowd. It was the sound a cornered badger made right before the dogs tore it apart. He didn't feel a sudden surge of righteous fury. Garfield wasn't a hero. He was a man who lived at 9,000 feet because he preferred the company of timber wolves to human beings. He was 34, scarred from bear claws and frostbite, and he liked his silence. But that ragged breathing grated on his nerves. It was a miserable, helpless sound, and it irritated him that 50 men were standing around gawking at a tied-up animal. Jedediah raised his hand to strike the back of the woman's covered head. "Come on, 50 cents. Who wants a mute plow horse?" $3, Garfield said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed the rough, gravelly weight of a rock slide. The crowd parted slightly, heads turning. Jedediah froze, his hand suspended in the air. $3? Jedediah squinted through the dust. He recognized Garfield. Everyone in Oakhaven knew the mountain man who only came down twice a year and looked at them like they were an infection. You bidding on the bride, Cobb?" Garfield didn't answer. He shifted the flour sack to his left arm, reached into his heavy canvas trousers, and pulled out 3 silver Morgan dollars. He tossed them. They flashed in the harsh sunlight and landed in the dirt at Jedediah's boots. "Untie the rope," Garfield said. Jedediah scrambled to pick up the coins, biting one to test the silver. He grinned, exposing black gums. "She's your problem now, mountain man. Don't come crying to me when you wake up and see the devil looking back at you." He dropped the rope and backed away. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that the spectacle had ended without violence. Garfield walked over to the woman, Close up, he could smell her. Sweat, dried mud, and fear. Her wrists were bound tight, the hemp digging into her pale skin, leaving angry red welts. Garfield pulled his skinning knife from his belt. The woman flinched violently, shrinking away from him. "Hold still," he grunted. He didn't wait for her to comply. He grabbed the rope above her wrists, avoiding touching her skin, and sliced upward. The hemp snapped. Her arms fell to her sides, heavy and lifeless. She rubbed her raw wrists, her head turning blindly toward the sound of his voice. "You got a name?" Garfield asked. She hesitated. From the slit in the burlap, a raspy, dry voice emerged. "Clara." "All right, Clara. I'm Garfield." He turned his back on her, hoisting the flour sack higher. "My mule is down by the trough. We have a 5-hour climb before dark. Keep up." He didn't wait to see if she followed. He just started walking. The trail up the jagged spine of the Bitterroot Ridge was steep and unforgiving. Pine needles muffled the sound of Garfield's boots and the clatter of the mule's hooves, but the wind compensated by howling through the narrow canyons. Garfield walked at the front, leading the mule. Barnaby, by the reins. Clara walked behind the mule. For 3 hours, he hadn't looked back. He knew she was there by the soft, dragging shuffle of her bare feet on the rocks. He felt a gnawing ache of regret settling in his gut. $3. He could have bought 3 months of coffee and enough chewing tobacco to last until spring. Instead, he had bought a woman with a sack on her head. Why hadn't he told her to take it off in town? He didn't know. Maybe it was the way the men were looking at her. Maybe he figured a trapped animal needed a minute to breathe before it realized the cage door was open. Or maybe, deep down, he was superstitious enough to believe Jedediah's nonsense about monsters. The temperature plummeted as they crossed the timberline. The air grew thin and bit at the lungs. Garfield stopped to adjust the saddlebags. He glanced back. Clara was leaning against the trunk of a dead spruce, her chest heaving. The thin calico dress offered zero protection against the mountain chill. Her bare feet were bruised and bleeding, leaving faint, rusty smudges on the gray stones. She still wore the sack. Garfield frowned. He walked to the mule, untied his heavy wool bedroll, and carried it over to her. He held it out. She didn't reach for it. She just stared at him through the weave of the burlap. "Wrap it around yourself," he said, his tone flat. "I'm not digging a grave in frozen dirt tonight." Slowly, trembling hands reached out and took the blanket. She draped it over her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me. Just don't die on my trail." They reached the cabin, just as the sun slipped below the jagged peaks, plunging the world into a deep, bruised purple. Garfield's cabin was built of heavy, unpeeled logs. It wasn't pretty. The roof was sod and bark, and the chimney was stacked riverstone, but it was solid, and the wind couldn't find a way in. He pushed the heavy plank door open and ushered her inside. The interior smelled of old wood smoke, dried sage, and gun oil. It was entirely one room. A cast-iron stove sat in the center, flanked by a rough-hewn table, a single chair, and a low bed in the corner covered in bear pelts. It was the lair of a solitary beast. Garfield struck a match against the doorframe. The sulfur flared bright, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. He touched the flame to the wick of an oil lantern on the table. Warm yellow light spilled outward. Clara stood by the door, clutching the wool blanket around her throat. She looked entirely out of place, a ghost haunting a woodsman's shed. Garfield walked to the stove, opened the iron door, and began feeding kindling into the belly. "Sit down," he ordered, not looking at her. "Water pump is outside, but there's a pitcher on the washstand. Drink." He heard the scrape of the wooden chair as she sat. He lit the fire, watching the orange flames lick at the dry pine. The heat began to radiate outward, thawing the chill from the room. He stood up, wiping soot from his hands onto his trousers. He turned to face her. She was sitting rigid in the chair. The sack was still over her head. The absurdity of it finally broke through his thick, solitary patience. He walked over to the table and slammed his heavy hands down on the wood. The lantern glass rattled. Clara flinched, curling inward. "All right," Garfield said, his voice dropping an octave. losing its gruff edge and settling into something dangerously quiet. We are 9,000 feet up. There ain't a soul for 20 miles in any direction but you, me, and the mountain lions. I don't know what Jedediah did to you, and I don't care what you look like, but you ain't wearing a grain sack in my house." Clara stopped breathing. Her hands gripped the edges of the wool blanket so tightly, her knuckles popped. "Take it off," Garfield said. It wasn't a request. "You won't like it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They never like it," Jedediah said. "He said I make men sick, that I'm a punishment from God." Garfield scoffed, a short, bitter sound. "God doesn't care enough about Jedediah Rust to punish him. Take the sack off, Clara, or I'll cut it off you." She hesitated for a long, agonizing moment. The only sound in the cabin was the crackle of the pitch pine in the stove and the wind rattling the heavy wooden shutters. Slowly, her hands released the blanket. She reached up, hooking her dirt-caked fingers under the frayed edge of the burlap at her collarbone. Garfield braced himself. He expected a rotting disease. He expected a missing nose, or eyes boiled white by pox. He expected something that would make him turn away. Clara pulled the sack upward. It caught briefly on her hair, then slid free, dropping to the floor with a soft thud. Garfield took a sharp breath inward, the air catching in his throat. He stumbled a half-step back, his boot heel knocking into the iron stove. He actually gasped. It wasn't revulsion. It was an involuntary shock to his system. Clara's hair was chopped short, an uneven, jagged mess of dark, raven-black strands that framed her face. But her face, a thick, raised scar, shiny and silver, slashed diagonally across her features. It started at her left temple, cleaved through the bridge of her nose, and ended at the right side of her jaw. It was a violent, brutal testament to a knife or a shattered piece of glass. It warped the symmetry of her face, pulling the corner of her upper lip into a slight, perpetual sneer. But beneath the scar, her bone structure was impossibly sharp, aristocratic even. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and her eyes. Her right eye was a deep, warm amber, the color of aged whiskey. Her left eye, the one resting beneath the start of the scar, was a piercing, crystalline ice blue. She wasn't a monster. She looked like a fractured painting. She looked feral, beautiful, and utterly terrifying. Garfield couldn't speak. He just stared, his eyes tracing the line of the scar, the dirt smudged on her cheeks, the fierce, defensive tilt of her chin. Clara saw his reaction. She misread the shock for disgust. A bitter, cold resignation washed over her face. She didn't cry. She just lifted her chin higher, a defiant, angry pride radiating from her mismatched eyes. "Well?" she spat, her raspy voice suddenly laced with venom. "Go on. Say it. Get it over with. Tell me I'm a demon. Tell me I'm a freak." Garfield stared at her, the silence stretching tight between them. He looked down at the discarded burlap sack on the floor, then back up to her arresting, scarred face. "You're an idiot," Garfield said softly. He walked past her, picked up the iron kettle from the floor, and headed for the door. "I'm getting water for coffee. Throw that sack in the stove." He walked out into the freezing night, pulling the door shut behind him, leaving Clara sitting in the golden lantern light, entirely stunned. The iron stove had gone cold sometime around 3 in the morning. Garfield woke to the familiar ache in his left knee, a souvenir from a horse that had spooked near a cliff edge a decade ago. He didn't open his eyes right away. He lay on the hard plank floor, a single wool blanket pulled to his chin, listening. He heard the wind tearing at the roof shingles. He heard the settling groan of the pine logs. And then he heard the shallow, rhythmic breathing from the corner bed. Right. He'd bought a woman. Garfield sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. The coarse stubble scratched his palm. He felt a dull throb of a headache building behind his eyes, born entirely of regret. He hated deviations in his routine. He liked his mornings silent, his coffee black, and his thoughts empty. Now, there was another heartbeat in the room, taking up oxygen, demanding consideration. He pushed himself off the floor, joints popping in the freezing air, and walked to the stove. He didn't try to be quiet. If she was going to live up here, she needed to get used to the noise of survival. He shoved a heavy iron poker into the ashes, stirring the glowing embers buried deep at the bottom, and tossed in a handful of dry birch bark. It caught with a sharp hiss. "I'm awake," a raspy voice said from the shadows. Garfield didn't look over. He fed 2 larger pieces of split pine into the firebox and slammed the iron door shut. "I didn't ask." He walked to the washstand, poured freezing water from the pitcher into a tin basin, and splashed it over his face and neck. The shock of it drove the last of the sleep from his brain. When he finally turned around, drying his face with a rough towel, Clara was sitting up on the bear pelts. In the harsh, gray morning light filtering through the single frosty window, her scar looked angrier. It was a vicious, puckered ridge of tissue that caught the pale light. She caught him looking. Instantly her jaw tightened, and she turned her face toward the wall, presenting her unblemished side. "Don't do that," Garfield said. "Do what?" "Hide." He walked to the wooden shelf, grabbed a tin of coffee grounds, and began measuring it into the battered pot. "I bought you. I didn't buy half of you. Turn your head back around." She snapped her gaze back to him, her mismatched eyes blazing. The amber eye held a deep, smoldering fury. The blue eye was sheer, glacial defiance. "You like looking at it? Makes you feel big seeing something broken?" "Makes me feel nothing," Garfield lied smoothly. He carried the pot out the front door to fill it with snow. When he came back inside, kicking the door shut against a vicious gust of wind, he set the pot on the stove. "It's a scar. I've got one on my back from a grizzly that looks like a plowed field. You ain't special." Clara opened her mouth, a retort dying on her tongue. No one had ever told her she wasn't special for being hideous. They usually crossed the street, spit at her feet, or, in Jedediah's case, threw a sack over her head and charged admission. Garfield went to his canvas pack and dug around until he found an old, oversized flannel shirt and a pair of thick woolen socks. He tossed them onto the bed. They landed softly on her lap. "Put those on. That calico rag is useless up here. Then come to the table. I've got a tin of badger, fat, and sulfur. You're going to clean the cuts on your feet before they rot." Clara stared at the flannel shirt. It smelled intensely of wood smoke, pine pitch, and him. She looked up. Garfield was already ignoring her, slicing thick slabs of salt pork with his hunting knife. "Why did you buy me?" she asked. Her voice was quieter now, stripped of the defensive venom. Garfield threw a slab of pork into the cast-iron skillet. It sizzled violently, spitting grease. He watched the meat curl at the edges. Why had he? The truth felt too stupid to say out loud. "You were breathing like a dying badger," he grunted, flipping the meat with the tip of his knife. "It annoyed me." Clara sat still for a long moment. Then, slowly, she pulled the heavy flannel over her head. The fabric swallowed her, the hem dropping to her knees. She rolled the sleeves up 4 times just to free her hands. She slipped the wool socks over her bruised, bleeding feet. She walked to the table and sat down. Garfield pushed a small tin across the rough wood toward her, followed by a damp rag. "Clean them," he ordered. She dipped the rag in the icy water from the basin and began wiping the dried blood and dirt from her soles. She hissed through her teeth as the cold water hit the raw blisters. Garfield didn't offer to help. He just pushed a tin mug of boiling black coffee across the table. She took it, wrapping her frozen fingers around the hot metal. She took a sip. It was thick, bitter, and tasted faintly of dirt. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Stepfather," she said suddenly. Garfield paused, his mug halfway to his mouth. He looked at her over the rim. "The scar," Clara said, staring down into her black coffee. "It wasn't a bear. It was a broken whiskey bottle. I was 15. He missed my throat." She waited for the pity. She waited for the awkward shifting of weight, the clearing of the throat, the muttered apologies that people offered when faced with the ugly reality of other people's lives. Garfield took a slow drink of his coffee. He swallowed, set the mug down, and picked up his fork. "He dead?" Garfield asked. Clara blinked, thrown off balance. "Yes. Cholera. 2 years ago." "Good." Garfield stabbed a piece of salt pork and dropped it onto a tin plate. He shoved the plate toward her. "Eat. You're too skinny to survive the winter." Clara looked at the greasy meat, then up at the massive, scarred man sitting across from her. He was chewing his food, his attention already drifting toward the window and the snow clouds gathering over the ridge. A strange, unfamiliar sensation tightened in her chest. It felt terrifyingly like safety. Winter did not arrive. It assaulted. 3 weeks after Clara walked up the mountain, the sky turned the color of bruised iron, and the snow fell in thick, blinding sheets. The world outside the cabin vanished behind a wall of white. They had settled into a quiet, brutal rhythm. Garfield hunted, chopped wood, and maintained the gear. Clara cooked, mended clothes with clumsy but determined stitches, and kept the fire fed. They rarely spoke more than a dozen words a day. It was a house built on silence, but the silence had lost its jagged edges. It was no longer the tense quiet of a predator and prey trapped in a cage. It was the heavy, comfortable silence of two solitary creatures sharing a hollow log. It was mid-afternoon, though the sky was dark as midnight, when the cabin door burst open. A violent swirl of snow blew inside, coating the floorboards. Garfield stumbled through the doorway, dropping his heavy Sharps rifle. He was dragging the gutted carcass of a mule deer by its antlers. Clara dropped the shirt she was darning and stood up. Garfield heaved the deer inside, then leaned his weight against the heavy oak door, shoving it shut against the howling gale. He dropped the wooden latch into place and slumped against the wood. He was breathing hard, a wet, rattling sound. His heavy buffalo coat was stained dark, stiff, with freezing blood. "Garfield," Clara said, stepping forward. He waved a gloved hand dismissively, stripping the coat off and throwing it to the floor. "Not my blood. Got the deer. But the storm caught me 2 miles out. Snow's waist-deep in the drifts." He walked toward the stove, his boots leaving wet, crimson tracks. He held his trembling hands out to the iron. "Meat's going to freeze solid if we leave it in the shed. Have to process it in here." Clara looked at the dead animal bleeding onto the floorboards. The smell of copper and raw earth filled the cramped cabin, fighting the scent of wood smoke. A month ago, she would have retched. Now, she just walked to the washstand, grabbed her apron, and tied it around her waist. "Knives are on the block," she said. Garfield turned, raising an eyebrow. His beard was caked with ice. "You know how to butcher a deer?" "I know how to cut meat," Clara replied flatly. "And you're shaking too hard to hold a blade. Sit by the fire. Drink." She poured a measure of rye whiskey into a cup and shoved it into his chest. Garfield took the cup. He didn't argue. His core temperature was dangerously low, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He sat heavily in the wooden chair, sipping the fiery liquid, and watched her. Clara picked up his heavy skinning knife. It was a foot long, the bone handle worn smooth by his grip. It looked massive in her small hand. She knelt beside the carcass. She didn't hesitate. She found the edge of the hide at the sternum and slid the blade under the skin, pulling upward with a sharp, practiced jerk. For 2 hours, the only sounds in the cabin were the wind screaming outside, the crackle of the fire, and the wet tear of hide and muscle. Garfield eventually thawed enough to join her. They worked shoulder to shoulder on the floor, their hands covered in gore, separating the meat from the bone. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. When Clara needed the bone saw, Garfield handed it to her before she asked. When Garfield needed leverage to pull the hindquarter, Clara anchored the carcass. It was bloody, ugly, exhausting work. And it was deeply intimate. Clara pushed a heavy lock of raven hair out of her eyes with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of deer blood across her forehead. She sat back on her heels, breathing heavily. The floor was a mess of butchered cuts, ready for the salting barrel. Garfield looked at her. Her hands were stained dark. The flannel shirt was ruined. Her face was smeared with dirt and blood, the jagged silver scar cutting through the grime. She looked wild. He realized, with a sudden dull thud in his chest, that he didn't want the silence of the mountain anymore. He had spent 10 years trying to erase himself up here, trying to freeze out the memory of the world below. But looking at her, he realized he liked the noise she made. He liked the stubborn tilt of her chin. He liked that she didn't shrink from the blood. Garfield reached over. He didn't think about it. His large, calloused thumb, sticky with blood, brushed against her forehead, wiping the crimson smear away from her hairline. Clara froze. Her breath hitched. It was the first time he had touched her voluntarily since the day he cut the ropes off her wrists. He didn't pull his hand away immediately. His thumb traced the starting point of the scar at her temple. A rough, gentle pressure. "You did good, Clara," he said, his voice a low gravel rumble beneath the roar of the wind. Clara stared at him. The blue eye and the amber eye were wide, searching his face for the trick, the sudden cruelty that usually followed a soft moment. But Garfield's face was just tired, serious, and entirely open. She let out a long, shaky exhale. Her shoulders dropped. The defensive tension she had carried in her spine for years seemed to snap all at once. She didn't smile, she didn't know how to anymore, but the sneer softened. She looked down at her bloody hands, then back up at him. "We need to salt the meat before the fire warms it too much." Garfield nodded slowly. He pulled his hand back. "Yeah, I'll get the barrel." They stood up together, joints aching, hands filthy, the storm raging helplessly against the thick logs of the cabin. They were two broken things in a brutal world, smelling of blood and wood smoke, finding a quiet, stubborn way to survive. And for the first time in his life, Garfield Cobb looked at the long, dark winter stretching ahead of him, and he didn't feel cold. If this Wild West survival romance pulled at your heartstrings, do us a huge favor. Hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment below to let us know your favorite moment between Garfield and Clara. And don't forget to share this video with friends who love gritty, emotional stories. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our next deep dive storytelling adventure. See you on the trail.